demands that all Black office holders resign. And it ends up with hundreds of people being killed. And so you see incidents like this across the South, where what starts as an incidence of tax resistance turns into mass murder. And Dr. Logan's piece is extraordinarily important because it identifies that these aren't just one-off events. We can talk about sort of anecdotal incidents of violence, right? We don't even have them all recorded, of course, but across the board, what you see in terms of where are legislators most endangered, it is where they had done most to rebuild the tax code. And I think we sometimes think of taxation as a sort of boring side subject, but it's actually really central to our politics. It's not only the way that we pay for the basic goods that make us a democracy, like our schools, but it's also the portion of our labor that we dedicate to our democracy, right? And so it's sort of the lifeblood of democracy, and conservatives recognize that. And they recognized it 150 years ago, and they recognize it today. So what you see is this wave of violence, most extreme where taxes had gone up the most, that is to say, where they had done the greatest work to rebuild what could have been a real multiracial democracy. But the other piece of the fight that Confederates engaged in wasn't just about reaching poor whites, and it wasn't just about the extreme violence against freedmen. It was also about convincing the Northerners, because when it comes down to it, like, why does Reconstruction fail? It fails in a meaningful sense because the North stopped defending it, right? When the Northern Republicans agree to remove federal troops from the South, that is when you see the end of Black suffrage. And so this taxpayer rhetoric sold really well in the North. And the reason for that is partly because some people had gotten extremely rich during the war in the North. They were looking at their cities and seeing influxes of immigrants who were bringing ideas about class consciousness, right? Who were bringing ideas about workers' rights and about unions. And suddenly this idea of universal suffrage didn't sound so great, not just for Black people, but for working men. So in New York City, a campaign was closely fought to actually put basically all the city's powers in a board of finance that would be elected not by all men in the city. Universal suffrage had been in place for decades in New York, but they were going to take those powers and put them in the hands of people elected only by those who had paid something like $500 in taxes that year. This would have disenfranchised half of New Yorkers overnight. So when we're talking, no, go on.
Well, no,
I can talk about this endlessly.
Put raise a flag here, and just this idea that, if on this program I was talking about, hey, there's an attempt to create a finance board, and it's going to be elected just at, it's going to be elected at large, let's say, as opposed to through districts, because to run an at-large campaign, you need a lot more money, and it's not going to be funded by the city. It's not going to be matched donations. And, 80% of the people listening to me would fall asleep like, oh, this is so technical and such irrelevant. But that has been the mechanism in which power is exerted. It submerges a power grab in a technical move. A technical move can also do the opposite as well. It's just that there's a lot of money that finances the development of technical moves to hide power grabs rather than to disperse power grabs. And that's what brought about the North. And we should also note, because of this past week, that one of the reasons why the North also sort of ushered in this, or was willing to stand back and allow Jim Crow to usher in, dealt with a dispute over the Electoral College as well. Mm-hmm. Just remind us of that. I mean, we've talked about it in the past couple of days, but it's worth how it ties into this story.
That's right. So to maintain their hold on the presidency, the Republican Party was willing to sacrifice the continued presence of federal troops in the South, right? And so we get President Rutherford B. Hayes, and we abandon Black freedmen and the dream of universal male suffrage. And, when I wrote this piece in October and early November, and I was every day wondered what part of it was, I knew it was going to resonate. I didn't know which parts. And so on Wednesday, it was sort of the nightmare scenario coming true for me, because I spend a lot of time thinking about the capacity of white supremacist violence to undermine democratic practice in this country, and the capacity of Americans to legitimize with just even the faintest use of the faintest rhetoric that sounds like normal politics, to legitimize extreme violence, and I think obviously there are limits to all historical parallels, but I think that moment, it has a lot to say to us right now. And it has a lot to say to us because, not just because we're actually seeing violent white supremacist mobs, though we are, but because I think there's a real danger that people are going to try and assert that normalcy has returned. And one of the things that they'll point to is, oh, we're just arguing about taxes now. Oh, we're just arguing about budgets now. That's normal politics. These are regular Republicans. But that's why I think it's so important to recognize that the most extreme anti-democratic politics that America has ever seen, in some sense, was accompanied by rhetoric that could be said today.
Right.
Right?
How divorced are these things? At what point... I think there's an argument that that racism in and of itself is a function, again, of sort of something that is that was born, and I don't know if I fully subscribe to it, but that at the very least that racism is not necessarily organic. I mean, in the context of those Appalachian subsistence farmers, the racism is sort of a second order issue that develops around the taxation versus the opposite, or at least as a motivating factor. To what extent, has this dynamic when we talk about taxes, it's born out of a certain racism, but it's ultimately about certain people maintaining certain power and exploiting the racism. Where, has that connection ebbed and flowed over the years? I can't help but think about Lee Atwater on his deathbed saying, you can't say the N-word anymore, but you can talk about busing, you can talk about taxation. You cite Ronald Reagan and the tax, our tax dollars going to the welfare queens. It's all bundled up in there. Is it just sort of the relationship sort of undulates through history, but never breaks apart?
I think that a thing that might shock a contemporary American is the fact that taxation was not a particularly controversial issue in the mid-20th century. Neither party made it a major part of their platform. There was plenty of room for accord on questions of taxes. The time when you see taxes suddenly become an extremely controversial issue is at times when suffrage has expanded, right? And those are two major periods, when suffrage has expanded to poor people. And there are two major periods of that we're talking about today, right? First of all, obviously the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction, you might consider our first civil rights movement, and then our second civil rights movement. And the politics is the same politics. We're worried about taxation because suddenly the wrong people, quote unquote, are going to be able to make decisions about what government does, right? And decisions both about how government spends money and decisions about who government taxes. And so taxation really gets at the core tension between a commitment to political equality, which we have never fulfilled but have always claimed, and the reality of economic hierarchy. And of course, in the Reconstruction period, that economic hierarchy had been approximately as extreme as is possible. But it still exists today, and it's still a tension in our politics today, right? We say that we're all men are created equal. We say that we have a democracy of equal citizens, but we have an economic system that does not provide equal power to people. And so there's a tension there. And the tension falls heaviest on taxation, right? Because it is the money that turns private property into state power, right? And that tension doesn't go away, but it's much stronger when you see a sudden expansion in the range of people who are allowed to participate, right? And that's why taxation has been an issue my entire lifetime. And that's why taxation was an issue in 1870.
And it was the issue that partially birthed the nation, which is why it's so ironic that the patriots in the South, or as they were claiming to be, and even now today, they focus on politics and austerity when they've kind of reversed the power relationship. It's kind of the inverse there. So, I mean, you can make an argument that issues over power in taxation are at the forefront of, or at the core of every apex, every moment, important, punctuated moment in our history and in our current politics.
That's exactly right. I mean, because of the strength of anti-tax politics today, people sometimes misread onto the founders an anti-tax attitude, but they were no more anti-tax than they were anti-law, right? Because they didn't want the British taxing them. They didn't want Britain writing laws for America either, right? But that didn't mean that they didn't think taxes or laws should be implemented with representation. They certainly did think those things should be. But it does. It's exactly that. You're exactly right. That the question of who governs, it hits home when it's tax dollars.
Well, so is it ultimately a fear? It's a fear of a loss of political power, and political power in the context of our government is really just where resources are dedicated to, right? And who gets the bounty of government. I mean, if government just built, high-end golf courses, there may not be as much of a concern about taxation, right? I mean, like that, I'm just trying to tease out that as we get emancipatory movements, it starts a whole nother series of generations of tax complaints. Because when you talk about the 40s and 50s, you're talking about in the early 60s, you're talking about highest marginal tax rates at what would be equivalent to $3 million today. And every dollar after that, 90 cents goes to the government. 90 cents after every dollar after $3 million. And then the Civil Rights Act happens, and all of a sudden, it's like within a decade, the tax rate is a third of that. Is it the distribution of the money? Is it the confiscation of the money? Is it just the notion of lack of control? Or is it just sort of hard to disaggregate all those things?
I think that there is, one of the things that's striking about the Civil War is, of course, Abraham Lincoln wasn't going to free the slaves. I mean, he did free the slaves because of the war, right? And he was personally opposed to slavery. He said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. But he wasn't planning a great abolitionist campaign. And, and I think there's some similarities now that conservative politics asserts, the threat of communism today. Joe Biden.
Right.
There's a real gap there between the politics that is likely to be implemented and the rhetorical claims of the conservative side. So I think that there tends to be a real disconnect, a sort of drama, you might call it, when it comes to talking about what the other side might do. And in some ways, it brings about its own defeat, at least it has historically. There was a great piece I read recently, someone who studied the rhetoric of congressmen before the Civil War and from the South. And of course, they were constantly giving these, speeches about terrible oppression they were facing and how the South, but they were just ginning up their base. They didn't mean it. Of course, they were friends with the other congressmen. This was just, red meat for the base. And then it kind of got out of their hands. And some of them were genuinely surprised by what happened. And so I think that, the actual dangers posed by, for example, the expansion of democracy to universal suffrage does not necessarily result in progressive taxation. You actually see progressive taxation come in when you have major wars, right? So it's the fear that you can't, the fear of democracy, I think, is sometimes more extreme than it needs to be, and actually, in some sense, provokes emancipatory movements. They're constantly seeing emancipatory movements when sometimes they're not even ready. They're not even there. But and that's what you see in the Civil War.
It's fascinating. It's slightly irrational on some level, which suggests that maybe it comes back to just simply just an overall fear and an ignorance that is, sometimes difficult to distinguish from racism or anti-immigrant sentiment. I mean, it's a fascinating piece. Vanessa Williamson, folks can find it in Dissent Magazine. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, folks, going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Wrap up things here.